I can still taste the dust that rose from the gravel road as I stepped off the bus in March 1947, my boots hitting the earth like a man returning to a country he no longer recognized. The war had ended nearly 2 years earlier, but in me, the shrapnel pulsed just beneath the skin like ghosts refusing to rest. Inside the frayed inner pocket of my army coat, I carried a letter I never sent, scrawled under a grey sky somewhere near Arnhem, Holland. She had promised to wait for me, and I, young and foolish enough to believe in promises made under fire, believed her. But when I walked up to the fence of the old family farm in rural Kansas, the wooden gate groaned as if to say, "Someone else lives here now," or maybe it was the land itself warning me, "Everything's different." Still, I whispered to myself that cold morning, if I could just hear her say my name one more time, everything broken in me might start to make sense again. The house stood tired and quiet, its white paint peeled by winters I hadn't seen, the front porch bowed under its own weight. The trees were still there, the same oak that held our childhood tire swing, though the rope was gone. Even the wind felt familiar and cruel, the kind of wind that carries memory and shame alike. The neighbors, what few remained, watched from behind torn curtains. Some nodded, most just looked away, as if seeing me whole in body was a reminder of how many never came back at all. I walked the main street such as it was, just a post office, a diner, and Mr. Halverson's general store. It was there that I learned she had taken over her father's business after he never returned from a trip to Chicago in '45. Each step toward that storefront was like walking across a minefield of memories. The boards on the sidewalk creaked in the same places. The old church bell still hung, silent, and above it all a question echoed louder than any bullet I'd dodged in Europe. Would she still remember my name? She had written once that names were anchors, that when I returned she'd call mine, and it would mean I was home. Back then, it sounded poetic, something to hold on to when the nights were long and loud with fire. But now, with war behind me and nothing familiar ahead, it felt like a lifeline I wasn't sure I deserved. If this story moves you the way it moved me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing true stories that inspire, touch, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. I walked through that old town like a ghost, retracing steps no one remembered. The Kansas sun was sharp, unkind, and the dirt roads that used to carry the sound of bicycles and Sunday church shoes now sat quiet, layered in dust and stories no one wanted to retell. I passed the gas station where Jimmy used to pump quarters into the jukebox, the schoolyard where we carved our initials into the swing set post, and every corner whispered to me in a language made of memory and regret. The houses were smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just grown too much, not in height but in burden. Many windows were boarded up, patched with whatever could be found. Old doors, tin signs, cracked wood, like people trying to seal in what little warmth remained. I recognized a few faces. Mrs. Emmons, who used to sell pies at the town fair, glanced at me and then quickly looked away. Old man Traeger nodded from his porch but said nothing. Their eyes all said the same thing. You made it out, but someone else didn't. The worst part wasn't the stares, it was the silence that came with them. I ended up in Halverson's general store, that same weathered building with the creaky wooden steps and the dusty porch where she and I used to sit with orange sodas in the summer. Mr. Halverson was gone, past the year before, I'd later learn, and now she was behind the counter. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The weight of years, the space between us. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I watched her from behind the shelves of canned beans and soap, watched her lift a crate like it weighed more than just supplies. Her hair was pulled back the same way, but her eyes, they didn't shine the way they used to. When she finally looked up, her face stopped moving. For a breath, maybe two. Then she blinked and turned away. It was there, between sacks of flour and boxes of old postcards, that I realized something terrible. She wasn't expecting me. Every letter I hadn't sent, every word I'd scribbled into dirt and whispered to myself in the dark, none of it reached her. She had moved on, or tried to. But there was something in her posture, in the way her hands trembled slightly as she counted change, that told me she hadn't forgotten everything. Maybe not yet. Then I saw him, a boy, maybe 6 years old, peeked out from behind the curtain leading to the back room. His hair was the color of hers, his eyes unmistakably mine. He stared at me for a second before darting away, disappearing behind the shelves like a shadow that had learned not to be seen. My heart stopped. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. They'd written once, early on, then nothing. And they never told me anything about a child. I stepped back outside, breathing air that suddenly felt too heavy. My boots hit the wood like they did back in Europe, unsure, deliberate. I sat down on the edge of the porch, watching the world pass by slower than I remembered. A rusty pickup, an old hound trotting along the dirt, the wind teasing the flags outside the post office. The world had moved on without me, and I didn't know where to put myself anymore. That night, I slept in the old barn behind my parents' land, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in on the east side, the hay smelled moldy and old, but it held me. And in the silence, I replayed every step I'd taken that day. Could she still remember the boy who promised her everything under the stars? Did she hear my name in her sleep? Did she ever wonder if I was still alive? The next morning I returned, not for answers, just to see her again, maybe to say goodbye. She was out front sweeping the porch, and when she saw me, she didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. That meant something. I stepped up slowly, like I was afraid the wood might splinter under my weight. "I didn't die," I said, "but some parts of me did." She stared at me. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I waited. "I didn't know," she finally whispered. "They told me you were gone." I nodded. I thought I was. I don't remember the exact date, only that it was November and cold enough to stiffen the ink before it hit the page. I was crouched in a narrow trench near the Belgian border, boots soaked, fingers numb, and the sky above us churned like something alive, grey, bitter, unforgiving. Around me, the world was shaking. The ground trembled from distant shell fire, and the smell of smoke mixed with the iron tang of blood and wet soil. But in my hands, I held something far more fragile than any rifle or ration tin. A piece of scrap paper torn from the inside of a field manual. It wasn't much, just big enough for a few lines, but it was all I had, and I needed to write to her. The mud came up to my ankles, and every time I shifted to get comfortable, I sank deeper. My pencil was broken on one end, chewed on the other, barely holding together. But I steadied it against my knee, braced myself with the side of the trench, and wrote, "I'll come back. I swear it. I'll build you a porch facing the morning light. We'll plant apple trees and wait for the snow." My handwriting shook with every nearby blast, but the words were steady in my mind, promises formed in the silence between gunfire and fear. Each letter I carved into the damp paper was more than ink. It was me, the version of me who still believed in something gentle, something warm, her. I didn't write about the war, not the way it smelled or sounded. I wrote about her hands, the way she laughed when she leaned back against the old fence by the creek. I wrote as if I was speaking to her, whispering into her ear instead of into the darkness. There was a moment, maybe just seconds, when the gunfire stopped. I remember that because it felt wrong, like the earth was holding its breath. In that silence, I wrote one last sentence. "Call me by name, and I'll know I made it home." Then, as if the words had summoned the gods of war, a shell exploded so close that dirt and metal rained down on my helmet. I dropped the pencil. My hands were bleeding from the shrapnel that had carved a small wound along my palm. Still, I folded the paper, slipped it into the inner pocket of my coat, and pressed it against my chest like it could hold me together. I didn't send it. There was no mail that week, or the next. But I carried that letter with me through every frozen march, every sleepless night in foxholes that felt like graves. When the bullets missed me, I thanked the letter. When the medic stitched my shoulder and asked what I was clutching so tightly, I didn't answer. I couldn't. It was mine, a thread connecting me to a world where the air didn't smell like rot, and I wasn't just another uniform in a sea of mud. Even as my boots wore through, even as I watched friends vanish beside me, I kept the letter dry, tucked in wax paper, tucked in memory. And sometimes at night I would read it again, not with my eyes, but in my mind. I'd trace the lines word for word, hear her voice in each sentence. I'd remember why I had to survive, not for medals, not for the flag, but for the chance to hand that letter to her, to see her open it, smile, and say my name like it meant something again. When the war ended, I brought it home. Folded, worn thin at the creases, stained a little red from that day in the trench, but intact. I didn't show it to anyone. I couldn't. It wasn't just a letter anymore. It was my soul on paper. It was the only part of me that never broke, even when everything else did. Now in the quiet of this town, where trains pass slowly and the wind moves like memory, I keep it with me still. Sometimes at night I unfold it and run my fingers over the words, and sometimes I wonder if I'll ever find the right moment to give it to her. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe it did its job already, not by reaching her hand, but by keeping me human. In a world built on orders and blood, that little piece of paper reminded me I had a name, a home, and a reason to come back. I watched the boy, her son, maybe mine, running through the grass with a stick for a sword, and I feel the weight of the letter against my chest. It was born in fire and fear, but it made it here, and so did I. The next morning, I woke in the remains of the barn behind the farmhouse, damp hay pressing against my back, the cracked rafters above framing a sky I barely recognized. My bones ached from sleeping on cold wood, but it felt like the only place I could breathe. I dressed quietly and walked back toward the small town, each step a question. What else had changed while I was gone? Each answer seemed to leap at me from the shutters, from the faded signs, from the hush of everything here. In the general store, she was already there, sweeping. She didn't look up when I walked in. She just kept sweeping. I cleared my throat. She stopped, lifted her eyes, and in that gaze I saw the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. I came in closer. She set the broom down, motioned toward a chair. I sat. The boy, 6 years old, tentative, peeked in from the back room. After a heartbeat, she introduced him. "This is my son, David." That name felt like a shard in my chest, but I kept breathing, kept sitting. I tried to smile. "He looks full of life." She watched me carefully. "He is." Then her voice faltered. "You never asked about him." I paused, feeling the question like a stone in my throat. I hadn't even known. I thought, later I'll ask, when the weight of everything else is lifted. But now the weight was pressing through my chest, pressing down on the space between us. "I didn't know," I said softly. And in saying it, the confession cracked the armor I'd worn all these years. I didn't know you had a child." She nodded, her shoulders tensing. "I didn't tell anyone. I thought if you came back, this would be your world too. But you never wrote. No response. So I had David alone." The confession caught in the air, and for a moment I heard nothing but the hum of an old fridge somewhere in the back. I wanted to reach for her, say I'm sorry, but I didn't trust my voice. Instead, I looked at David. He watched us, shy but not afraid. He held something in his hand, a small wooden toy car. The toy's paint was chipped and faded like everything else here. But to him it was perfect. I asked about him, not questions about the war or why I'd left, but gentle ones. What he likes to draw, what he hates for dinner, what makes him laugh. She answered, her voice building, soft truths spilling out. He liked baseball, hated soup, laughed at the way kittens chased shadows. My heart twisted. He sounded like me when I was his age. I thought, did I miss all that? Then she started to clear the counter, put cups on the shelves, and I realized she was trying to move the moment forward. I let it happen. The silence was less heavy now. I touched the letter in my coat pocket. It was the only thing I brought back, the only truth I still held inside. When the store bell jingled, an old farmer came in needing cornmeal. I rang it up and he said, "Welcome back, son," and looked at me like he saw history in my face. She glanced at him, flushed slightly. and I realized how fragile this moment was, how easy it could shatter. After he left, she turned to me and handed me a folded photograph. It was a picture of her, me, and another man, maybe me from years before, with a young smile. And beside him, a baby wrapped in a blanket. I recognized myself holding the baby. Cold dawn memory surfaced. I visited her once after basic training, held her and the baby on a summer porch swing. That day we planned everything. That day we believed in us. Tears filled her eyes then. I found this in my jewelry box. I didn't know what to do with it. Her voice broke. I took the photo gently, running fingers over the baby's face. I looked up at her. I remember. I felt the years fall away. I remember the night you called my name. She inhaled sharply. The moment quivered. We both knew I said the name. She'd called mine back before I left, but neither of us had said it again until now. That photograph was more than paper. It was proof that history happened here, not just in Europe, that we had built a life, however brief, before the war took me, and that life had continued after without me. I realized then my home wasn't just the farm. It was her and him. It had always been. I left the store that day with questions still on my tongue, but I could breathe under the sky again. Outside, the boy came running after me with his wooden car. He held it up. "For you," he said. I knelt, took it, and handed it back. We looked at each other, strangers on either side of family, learning how to belong. He nodded. I turned to her. She smiled. It wasn't the same smile from our youth. It was deeper, honest, shaped by years of life and loss. "Let's go home," I said. And she answered softly with her eyes, "We will." The late afternoon light bled through the glass of the general store windows, golden and still, casting long slanted lines across the floor that felt more like shadows of another time than anything of the present. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I stood by the doorway, coat folded over my arm, the letter still tucked deep in my inner pocket, soft with age and soaked with memories I'd never spoken aloud. And I waited, breath held, not for permission to speak, but for the sound I had longed to hear more than anything in the world. My name, spoken by her. She was behind the counter, arranging jars that didn't need arranging, wiping shelves already clean. Her back turned just enough to make me wonder if she'd say it at all, if the years had silenced what once came naturally, if time had buried my name under too many seasons of absence and dust. But then, like a match struck in the dark, she turned and said it. Not loud, not dramatic, but with a bitterness that carried more power than any scream or kiss ever could. "Jonah." Just that. And everything in me broke and healed at once. She didn't rush to me, didn't reach across the counter, didn't cry or smile. Not yet, but I saw in her eyes the same storm I felt in my chest, that ache that comes from holding something in for far too long. And as I stepped closer, slow, like I was crossing a river of glass, I could barely breathe, because her voice had pulled something out of the grave, the part of me that knew who I was before. I left before the war turned names into numbers and memories into ash. I whispered her name too, not as a question, not as a test, but as a promise. Sarah. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the war, not the years we'd lost, not the silence between us. Because the bridge between two people isn't always built with words or explanations or apologies. Sometimes it's just a name, spoken softly in the right light, by the right person, in the place where you once belonged. She walked around the counter, slowly, deliberately, like she was remembering how to move toward me after so long. And when she stood in front of me, close enough to touch, she looked into my eyes and said it again, stronger this time, like she meant to anchor me with it. "Jonah." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until it escaped me in a sharp, shaking sigh, and I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the letter, folded so many times the creases had become scars. And I held it out, not as a gift, not as an explanation, but as a part of me I could finally let her hold. "I wrote this in the trenches," I said. "Never mailed it. Carried it across every mile between there and here." She didn't take it at first, just looked at it, looked at me, and I could tell she was trying to understand whether the man in front of her was still the boy who wrote those words. Then, gently, she took it from my hand and pressed it against her heart. Behind her, I saw David watching us from the doorway, his small face filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a stranger to him, because I saw myself in the way he stood, unsure but rooted. I knelt down to his level, placed a hand on my knee to keep steady, and said, "I'm your father, David. I didn't know you existed, but I think I always hoped you might." He looked at me, then at Sarah, and finally stepped forward, not to speak, but to hand me something, a small wooden plane, chipped at the wing but still whole. And in that gesture, something passed between us, something not yet language, but more than silence. When I stood again, Sarah stepped closer and took my hand, and we stood there, three people with more questions than answers, but all of us finally facing the same direction. And I turned to her and said, "When you said my name, it brought me home." She nodded, the tears in her eyes finally falling, and in that old general store, with the past still breathing through the floorboards and the future wide open in the stillness between our hands, I knew we weren't trying to return to what we were. We were becoming what we could be. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the whole town in golden light, and I could hear wind rustling the trees like distant applause. And as we walked out the door, together, I knew I'd keep hearing her voice saying my name, again and again, every time I needed to remember that I had survived. Sometimes I sit on that old porch where the creak of the rocker under me feels like the whisper of history itself, and I trace my fingers along the grain of the wood, wondering how many secrets these boards have held. The soldiers who came home, the wives who waited, the children who grew up hearing stories in fading daylight. And in those moments, I realize that a name spoken with love, even one whispered after all this time, is more powerful than any letter never sent, because it carries with it the weight of memory, forgiveness, and the simple truth that we remain more than survivors. We remain human. I look at Sarah's hand in mine and feel the pulse of 1,000 heartbeats echoing through the years of separation, of letters that sailed nowhere, of evenings waiting by a silent mailbox. And I understand that healing isn't a grand event, but a quiet series of truths spoken across a kitchen table or a store counter, where apologies are made without flourish, but with depth and the unspoken promise. To carry each other forward becomes a bond stronger than silence itself, because in small-town America after the war, with children playing outside and neighbors rebuilding their lives, it was often the unremarkable gestures, the turning of a key, the folding of a note, the call of a name, that mended what the battles broke. On nights when David sleeps between us, curled like an argument resolved, I think back to that trench in Europe where I pressed the letter to my heart, feeling the pulse of home in the thrum of my ribcage, and I realized that surviving was only half of the journey. It was the moment Sarah said my name, soft and sure, that completed the circle, because while mail routes collapsed under fire, and most letters never arrived, voices could find their way through time and absence to bring us back to who we are, to who we were, and to who we can still become together. There are no more absolute certainties in life, but I believe this, that our wounds, psychological, unseen, carried by men like me returning from war, are both a curse and a badge, and when shared, they become a bridge to someone else's understanding. And so I tell Sarah often that each time I hear her say Jonah, it stitches a piece of me back together, because names are not mere labels, they are the vessels of presence, acknowledgement and grace made tangible. And this unassuming power, quiet though it may be, has the capacity to restore a man to himself after everything else is lost. The future is not mapped out for us. There are days when the past calls louder than the present, when the silence of a sleeping child feels too heavy, when the grief of comrades left behind floods through me like winter's chill. But then Sarah squeezes my hand, Or David laughs and drops a toy plane in my lap, and the letter folded in my coat pocket reminds me that I carried hope, mud-stained and blood-told, into the heart of darkness. And somehow carried it all the way back, so that now I can give my name to them, and they can give a name back to me. This is how we heal, step by careful step. By remembering that names bind us, letters may never arrive, but words can still reach home. And love, when it stands witness to absence and rebuilds itself in the quiet moments, becomes the antidote to war's uprooting, planting seeds of belonging even in the fallow fields of what remains. So here on this porch, as the wind flickers through the wheat fields like memory brushing the land, I say to you, softly but truly, thank you for calling me by my name. And maybe it isn't enough to undo everything, but it saves what was left of me. And perhaps that's more than just enough to begin again. If this story touched you as deeply as it touched me, please hit like, subscribe, and share what part of the story spoke to your heart the most. And remember that every day there are new stories of love, redemption, and hope waiting to be heard. Chuang Ti Ding Duan, Chuang Ti Di Duan.